The first thing Evelyn Harper noticed was not the for sale sign in the front yard. It was the bright orange price sticker someone had placed on her husband's old rocking chair. She stood motionless at the end of the hallway, grocery bags still hanging from one arm, listening to strangers discuss whether the chair would fit inside a pickup truck. A woman held up one of Evelyn's mixing bowls and asked if it came as part of a set. A young couple admired the antique dining table where 4 generations of her family had once shared Sunday dinners. The house was full of voices, yet no one noticed the 82-year-old woman standing quietly in the doorway of the home she believed she still owned. Late September sunlight drifted through the kitchen windows, catching tiny dust particles that floated above the worn wooden floor. Everything looked familiar except the handwritten price tags tied to lamps, quilts, and picture frames. Evelyn's oldest son, Thomas, hurried toward her the moment he saw her. His face carried more worry than welcome. "Mom," he said softly, "I was hoping we'd have this conversation after today." Evelyn looked past him at the people moving carefully through the living room. "What conversation?" she asked. Thomas hesitated. "We sold the house." The words landed with such quiet finality that for a moment the rest of the room seemed to disappear. Evelyn did not raise her voice. She did not accuse anyone. She simply looked around the home where she had baked thousands of loaves of bread, stitched quilts through long winters, and welcomed neighbors whenever they needed a warm meal or a listening ear. "You sold it," she repeated, almost as though she were trying to understand the sentence rather than argue with it. "The closing is next month," Thomas answered. We thought. We thought it was the safest decision." Before Evelyn could respond, an estate sale volunteer carried a small weathered wooden recipe box from the kitchen counter and set it onto a folding table near the front door. It was scratched along the edges, its brass latch slightly bent from decades of use. "How much for this little box?" a customer asked. The volunteer shrugged. "Probably just old recipes." Evelyn's eyes followed the box with sudden urgency. Of everything inside the house, it was the only object she instinctively stepped toward. She rested one trembling hand on its worn lid before anyone else could touch it. "No," she said quietly. "That one isn't just recipes." The room fell silent for only a heartbeat before the conversations resumed. No one asked why the old box mattered. No one noticed the tiny handwritten initials peeking from the edges of dozens of yellowed recipe cards inside. They saw an ordinary kitchen keepsake. Evelyn knew it was the only thing in the house that still remembered every meal she had ever made for someone who could never repay her. The estate sale continued as though nothing unusual had happened. Customers wandered from room to room, holding numbered tags, discussing antique cabinets, quilts, and cast iron cookware with the detached curiosity of people shopping on a Saturday morning. Evelyn remained in the kitchen, the old recipe box resting safely in her lap, while the sounds of strangers drifted through the open doorway. Thomas approached quietly. rubbing his hands together the way he always did when he felt uncertain. "Mom," he said gently, "please believe we weren't trying to hurt you." Evelyn looked up with tired but steady eyes. "Then, why didn't anyone ask me?" Thomas lowered his gaze. "The medical bills kept growing. My business hasn't recovered. Linda and I were falling behind on everything. We thought selling the house before something worse happened was the responsible choice." Evelyn listened without interrupting. She knew the burdens her son carried. She simply wished he had trusted her enough to carry part of them with him. Before she could answer, another customer stepped into the kitchen. It was Grace Miller, owner of Willow Creek Bakery. She had come hoping to purchase an old rolling pin she remembered from childhood baking demonstrations at church. The moment she saw Evelyn sitting quietly with the recipe box, her smile faded. "Mrs. Harper?" she asked softly. "I had no idea." Evelyn managed a small smile. "Neither did I until about 15 minutes ago." Grace sat beside her without another word. For several moments, they listened to the muffled conversations, filling the house. Finally, Grace glanced toward the weathered wooden box. "May I see it?" Evelyn nodded and gently lifted the brass latch. Inside, dozens of recipe cards rested in careful alphabetical order, each softened by decades of flour-dusted hands. Grace smiled as she recognized familiar names written across the top cards. Apple butter cake, Sunday cornbread, harvest apple pie, church supper rolls. "You taught half this town how to bake," Grace whispered. Evelyn chuckled softly. "I mostly taught people not to be afraid of making mistakes." Grace picked up a recipe for blackberry cobbler and paused. Tiny pencil marks filled one margin. Beside the ingredient list, someone had written LM. September 1987, extra cinnamon, delivered after evening choir. She frowned. "Did you revise the recipe that year?" Evelyn looked briefly at the note before gently shaking her head. "No." Grace reached for another card. Chicken pot pie. Again, tiny initials. Different date. Another brief handwritten note. Then another recipe. And another. Almost every card carried similar markings squeezed carefully into the margins. Written so neatly, they blended into the aging paper unless someone looked closely. "Mrs. Harper," Grace asked, "what do these initials mean?" Evelyn traced one faded pencil line with the tip of her finger, but did not answer immediately. Her expression grew distant, as though she were listening to voices only she could still hear. "People usually remembered the pies," she said at last. "Very few remembered where they went." Before Grace could ask another question, an estate sale volunteer appeared in the doorway holding a cardboard box. "We're packing the kitchen items next," she said politely. "Does this recipe box stay with the rest?" Thomas looked toward his mother, waiting for her answer. Evelyn slowly closed the lid and held the box a little closer. "No," she said quietly. "This one stays with me." Grace noticed something then that no one else seemed to see. Evelyn was not protecting a collection of recipes. She was protecting a lifetime of memories written in handwriting so small that almost everyone had mistaken them for ordinary cooking notes. And somehow, those tiny initials scattered across dozens of recipe cards felt far more important than measurements of flour or sugar. Grace carried the recipe box back to her bakery after the estate sale closed for the evening, not because Evelyn had given it away, but because Evelyn quietly asked her to help sort the fragile cards before they became damaged. The little wooden box rested on the flour-dusted work table where Grace prepared bread every morning. As she carefully removed the recipes one by one, she realized the strange notes followed no cooking pattern at all. The ingredient lists rarely changed. The tiny pencil entries did. Some listed only initials and dates. Others added brief reminders. Delivered before first frost. Left on back porch. After Wednesday Bible study. No thank you needed. They sounded less like baking instructions and more like directions for acts of kindness. The following afternoon, Grace carried several photocopies of the cards to the monthly quilting circle at Willow Creek Community Church. She had not planned an investigation. She simply hoped someone might recognize the initials. During a break for coffee, she spread 3 recipe copies across a folding table. "Does anyone remember these?" she asked. Most of the women smiled at Evelyn's familiar recipes. Then, 90-year-old Ruth Collins adjusted her glasses and froze. Her finger rested on one faded notation written beside harvest apple pie. E.M. October 1983. Ruth's eyes slowly filled with tears. "That wasn't about apples," she whispered. Grace looked at her with quiet surprise. "What do you mean?" Ruth gently touched the initials. "Eleanor Martin." She paused before continuing. Her husband died during harvest that year. She had 4 children and almost no food left in the pantry. None of us wanted her to feel like a charity case. Ruth smiled softly through her tears. One evening, Evelyn showed up carrying an apple pie. Everyone thought she was simply visiting. What nobody knew was that 2 church families quietly brought groceries later that same night, because Evelyn had already spoken to us. Grace looked again at the small pencil note. Suddenly, it no longer resembled a recipe revision. It was a quiet record of compassion. Another woman leaned closer to study a different card. "Wait a minute," she said. "These initials, L.M. That's Louise Mitchell." She laughed gently as memory returned. Evelyn baked cinnamon bread every Tuesday while Louise was caring for her husband after his stroke. We all thought she simply liked baking extra loaves. One memory awakened another. Names hidden behind initials slowly became real people again. A retired farmer remembered soup arriving after a barn fire. A widow recalled finding fresh biscuits on her porch every Saturday morning without ever discovering who left them. A former choir director quietly admitted that Evelyn often volunteered to bake one more casserole than the church requested because she already knew someone too proud to ask for help would need supper before the week ended. None of those stories had ever been announced from the pulpit. None appeared in church newsletters. They had lived quietly inside ordinary meals. Grace listened as the women spoke, then carefully looked back through the recipe cards. The dates stretched across 4 decades. Hundreds of tiny notes filled the margins. She realized Evelyn had not been recording recipes at all. She had been preserving a private map of anonymous kindness so she would never accidentally forget someone who once needed a meal, encouragement, or simply the dignity of being cared for without public attention. As the quilting circle ended, Ruth folded her hands gently over the copied recipe cards. People always praised Evelyn's baking, she said softly. The truth is, the recipes were never the most important thing she was making. Grace closed the box with new reverence. Outside the church windows, the evening sun settled over Willow Creek, while inside, a handful of faded initials had begun giving forgotten neighbors their names back. Saturday brought twice as many visitors to the Harper house as the first day of the estate sale. Some came looking for antique furniture. Others came because they had heard whispers about the elderly woman whose children had sold the family home without telling her. The story had begun traveling through Willow Creek, but like most stories, it arrived in pieces. A few people blamed Thomas without hearing his reasons. Others insisted he had done what any practical son would do. The house slowly became more than an estate sale. It became a conversation about what a lifetime could truly be worth. Evelyn remained in the kitchen, quietly wrapping the recipe box in an old flour sack she had embroidered decades earlier. She no longer looked at the furniture leaving through the front door. Every chair and table carried memories, but she had already learned that memories could not be tied down with price tags. Grace arrived carrying several photocopies of the recipe cards. She did not interrupt the sale or make a dramatic announcement. Instead, she placed the copies beside a tray of fresh cinnamon rolls she had baked from Evelyn's own recipe and quietly offered coffee to anyone who wished to rest for a few minutes. It did not take long before conversations began naturally. Ruth Collins recognized another set of initials. A retired deacon remembered delivering groceries after a factory accident because Evelyn had quietly organized help before anyone else knew there was a need. An elderly widow smiled through tears as she pointed to one faded notation. "That pie wasn't for me," she said softly. "It was for my grandson after his mother passed away." Evelyn told him she simply had too much pie that week. One story led gently to another. Visitors who had arrived, hoping to purchase dishes or lamps, found themselves lingering around the kitchen table, listening to memories that had never been spoken aloud at church dinners or town celebrations. Meanwhile, Thomas watched from the dining room doorway. At first, he assumed people were simply comforting his mother. Then he noticed something unusual. Every few minutes, someone recognized another set of initials. Every recognition uncovered another act of quiet generosity. None of the stories sounded exaggerated. They came from different decades, different families, and different corners of town, yet they all carried the same pattern. Evelyn had helped people without allowing them to become public examples of charity. A man carrying a vintage floor lamp paused before leaving. "Mrs. Harper," he said, "my father always wondered who left homemade soup on our porch after his back injury. I think I finally know." Evelyn smiled kindly but only answered, "Your father worked hard. He deserved a warm meal." Thomas felt an unexpected weight settle in his chest. He had grown up inside this very house. He remembered his mother baking long after everyone else had gone to bed. He remembered extra casseroles cooling on the counter and pies disappearing before supper. As a boy, he assumed she simply enjoyed cooking. He had never asked where the food went. Looking around the crowded kitchen now, he realized that the busiest room in the house had never really been a kitchen. It had quietly served as a place where burdens were divided before anyone outside the family ever noticed. Yet when one visitor gently suggested postponing the sale until the family understood the recipe box better, Thomas shook his head with visible strain. "I wish it were that simple," he admitted. "These stories mean more to me than I can explain. But memories don't pay hospital bills or business loans. The closing is already scheduled." His words carried no anger, only exhaustion. The room fell silent because everyone understood he was not choosing money over his mother. He believed he was choosing survival. Grace looked around the kitchen, filled with recipe cards, remembered kindness, and people whose lives had quietly intersected with Evelyn's generosity. For the first time, she realized the greatest challenge was no longer uncovering the meaning of the handwritten notes. It was helping a family, and perhaps an entire town, discover whether a legacy measured in compassion could still shape decisions after the contracts had already been signed. On Sunday afternoon, after the last estate sale visitor had gone home, Grace returned the recipe box to Evelyn's kitchen table. The house felt strangely quiet, without strangers wandering through its rooms. Half the china cabinet stood empty. Several family photographs had already been packed away. Yet the little wooden box seemed untouched by all the change surrounding it. Evelyn slowly lifted the lid and removed a recipe for chicken and dumplings. "People always asked why these tasted different," she said with a faint smile. "The recipe never changed." Grace looked down at the tiny pencil notes filling the margin. "Then what did?" Evelyn rested the card gently on the table. "The person who needed it." Grace frowned slightly. Evelyn reached for another card. "Blackberry cobbler." Beside the ingredients appeared the initials H. B, followed by the words, "No sugar talk. Just listen." Then another card. "Vegetable soup. RT. Leave after dark. Pride is hurting more than hunger." Another. "Sunday rolls. New baby. Double batch. Pretend the church baked too many." Grace read each note carefully. None referred to baking techniques. Every one described a human need. Evelyn folded her hands. "When I was young, I thought helping people meant solving their problems." As I got older, I learned something different. She smiled softly. Most people already know they're struggling. They don't need to be reminded. They need to be loved without feeling smaller. Grace looked around the familiar kitchen. So the recipes weren't really records of meals. Evelyn nodded. They were reminders. Reminders of what? Of how each person needed to receive kindness. She gently tapped the recipe card. One widow needed someone to stay for coffee because the silence frightened her. One farmer needed bread left on the porch because accepting it face to face embarrassed him. A young mother needed pie because she hadn't celebrated her birthday after losing her husband. The food was never the whole gift. Grace felt the meaning of the tiny notes change once again. They were not simply a history of anonymous generosity. They were a careful guide to preserving another person's dignity. Every margin held instructions not for cooking, but for compassion. Just then, Martha Ellis from the church knocked softly before stepping inside with a worn cookbook tucked beneath her arm. "I think this belongs with your recipe box," she said. She explained that years earlier, Evelyn had loaned the cookbook to help prepare a church harvest supper, and somehow it had remained on Martha's shelf ever since. As Grace opened it, several folded slips of paper drifted onto the table. They were not legal papers or hidden deeds. They were handwritten thank you notes from different families, many unsigned except for first names or initials. One simply read, "Whoever left the bread on our porch saved us from choosing between groceries and medicine this week. We never learned your name, but God surely knows it." Another said, "You made my children think neighbors still cared after the fire. That mattered more than the casserole." Evelyn smiled quietly. "I forgot those were in there." Grace looked from the notes to the recipe cards spread across the table. The initials matched. The dates matched. The stories told by neighbors matched. The recipes had become a map, and the thank you notes were the voices of people who had walked its path. Word of the notes spread gently through Willow Creek over the next 2 days. People began arriving not to buy furniture, but to share memories. Someone remembered finding warm biscuits after losing a job. Another recalled birthday cookies appearing every year until his mother recovered from surgery. None of them had known the full story before. Piece by piece, Evelyn's quiet ministry emerged from ordinary recipe cards that had spent decades hiding in plain sight. Even Thomas stood silently beside the kitchen doorway, listening as strangers described moments from his own childhood home that he had never witnessed. For the first time, he understood that his mother had not simply filled this house with the smell of fresh bread. She had filled an entire town with unnoticed acts of mercy, recording each one in tiny pencil marks so she would never forget that every recipe was meant to feed two families, the one receiving the meal and the one learning how to love without asking for recognition. By the middle of the following week, nearly everyone in Willow Creek had heard at least one story connected to Evelyn Harper's recipe box. People who had once stopped by the estate sale looking for bargains were now stopping simply to thank her. Some brought old photographs from church suppers. Others carried memories they had never shared before. The atmosphere around the Harper house had quietly changed. It no longer felt like a place being emptied. It felt like a place finally being understood. Yet every afternoon, the real estate sign still stood in the front yard. The purchase agreement remained valid. The closing date drew closer with each passing day. Kind words had softened hearts, but they had not erased contracts. Grace sat with Thomas at the kitchen table after another long afternoon of visitors. Between them lay the recipe box, several thank you notes, and a copy of the sale agreement. Thomas rubbed his forehead wearily. I wish these stories had surfaced 6 months ago, he admitted. Maybe I would have looked at this house differently. Grace answered gently, You are looking at it differently now. He nodded. Yes, but the bank isn't interested in recipe cards. His voice carried no bitterness, only fatigue. The medical bills are still there. My business loans are still there. The buyer has already made plans. I can't pretend those responsibilities disappeared because people finally learned who Mom really is. Grace could not argue with him. She had spent enough years running a small bakery to understand that compassion and financial reality often arrived at the same table together. Evelyn quietly poured coffee for both of them before taking her usual seat by the window. Thomas, she said softly, I never wanted this house to become a burden for you. He looked at her with tears beginning to form. It already was, Mom. I just never told you. For the first time in years, neither of them tried to protect the other from difficult truth. Thomas explained the debts he had hidden, the sleepless nights, and the fear of watching everything he had worked for collapse. Evelyn listened without judgment. When he finished, she reached across the table and gently squeezed his hand. You should have trusted me with your worries the same way everyone else trusted me with theirs. Thomas lowered his head. I thought I was protecting you. I know, she whispered. And I thought I was protecting you by pretending I didn't notice how tired you'd become. Across the room, Grace looked toward the recipe box. Every margin note she had read carried the same lesson. Evelyn had always believed people deserved help before shame had a chance to grow. Somehow that wisdom had not reached her own family. The next evening, the prospective buyer, Daniel Brooks, asked if he could visit the property before the scheduled closing. He had heard the stories spreading through town and wanted to see the house again with his own eyes. He walked slowly through the kitchen, noticing the worn countertop, the old oven, and the recipe box resting where it had always been. Grace shared a few of the handwritten notes. Evelyn answered his questions honestly. Thomas never tried to persuade him one way or the other. When the visit ended, Daniel stood quietly on the front porch, looking back through the kitchen window. I've bought buildings before, he said thoughtfully. I've never walked into one that already belonged to so many people. No one knew exactly what he meant. He offered no promises before driving away. The sale remained scheduled. The contracts remained unchanged. Yet something subtle had shifted. Until then, everyone had been asking whether the house could be saved. Now a different question began to emerge. If the walls had sheltered a lifetime of quiet generosity, perhaps preserving that legacy did not depend only on who held the deed. Perhaps it depended on whether the next chapter honored everything that had already been baked, shared, and remembered inside its kitchen. The closing was only 4 days away when Thomas asked his mother if he could borrow the recipe box for one evening. Evelyn looked at him quietly before placing it into his hands without a word. For decades, she had trusted strangers with their deepest burdens. She could certainly trust her own son with a wooden box. Thomas carried it home and sat alone at his kitchen table long after the house had gone quiet. For the first time in his life, he did not read the recipe cards looking for ingredients. He read them looking for his mother. One card after another revealed tiny pencil notes that now carried faces instead of initials. He recognized neighbors he had known as a boy. He remembered evenings when his mother disappeared into the kitchen after supper, returning hours later smelling faintly of cinnamon or fresh bread. He had always assumed she simply enjoyed baking. Now he understood she had been quietly carrying meals across town while he slept. Near the bottom of the box, Thomas found a recipe for oatmeal bread that had been folded more times than the others. The card looked ordinary until he noticed a familiar set of initials written in the margin. TH, his own. His hands stopped moving. Beneath the initials, in handwriting he had seen his entire life, his mother had written, Winter 1982. Thomas worries Daddy hears us talking about the bills. Bake bread before school so the house still smells safe when he comes home. Thomas closed his eyes. He had been 12 years old that winter. He remembered lying awake at night, hearing his parents whisper after they thought he was asleep. He remembered believing they were arguing. What he never knew was that his father had lost nearly 3 months of work after an injury, and the family had quietly depended on help from church friends, while Evelyn stretched every dollar without letting her children feel afraid. He turned to another card. Chicken noodle soup. Again, his initials appeared. Thomas pretending not to notice his shoes are too small. Mrs. Carter found new boots. Thank her without telling him. Another card. Peach cobbler. Celebrate Thomas making honor roll. He thinks we cannot afford a cake this year. The room blurred as tears finally reached his eyes. Every difficult season of his childhood had been carefully hidden behind warm meals, homemade desserts, and ordinary evenings that felt secure because his mother had worked tirelessly to make them feel that way. He had spent weeks convincing himself that selling the house was the practical decision. Only now did he realize the house itself had quietly protected him long before he was old enough to understand what sacrifice looked like. The next morning, Thomas drove to Willow Creek Bakery before sunrise. Grace was pulling fresh loaves from the oven when he walked in carrying the recipe box. He placed it gently on the counter. "I finally found my own initials," he said softly. Grace looked at him without speaking. "All this time," Thomas continued, "I thought these notes were about people my mother helped. I never imagined I was one of them." Grace rested a flour-covered hand on the wooden lid. "Most children never see the hardest work their parents do." Thomas nodded slowly. "Neither did I." Later that afternoon, he met with Daniel Brooks, the prospective buyer, at a small coffee shop on Main Street. Thomas did not ask to cancel the contract. He knew the agreement was still valid and understood the consequences of walking away. Instead, he told Daniel the truth, not just about the recipe box, but about his own childhood, the debts he had hidden, and the growing realization that he had measured the value of the house almost entirely by its market price. When he finished, Daniel stirred his coffee quietly before speaking. "You know," he said, "I develop commercial kitchens for restaurants. I usually evaluate a building by square footage, plumbing, and structural condition." He smiled faintly. "Your mother's kitchen may be the first one I've ever walked through that changed the person doing the measuring." Thomas left the meeting without knowing what Daniel intended to do. The closing date had not changed. The financial problems had not disappeared. Yet as he drove past the old Harper house that evening, he no longer saw only a piece of property. For the first time since placing it on the market, he saw it through the eyes of the little boy whose mother had quietly filled every room with the comforting smell of fresh bread so he would never have to carry worries far too heavy for a child. Closing day arrived beneath a clear Kentucky sky, but the atmosphere inside the Harper house felt nothing like a business transaction. Before anyone drove to the attorney's office, Daniel Brooks asked if everyone would gather in the old kitchen for a few minutes. The room filled quietly. Evelyn sat beside the worn oak table where she had rolled pie crusts for half a century. Thomas stood near the window with the recipe box resting gently in his hands. Grace placed several faded recipe cards beside a neat stack of handwritten thank you notes that neighbors had continued bringing throughout the week. Daniel looked around the room before speaking. "I came here intending to purchase a house," he said. "Instead, I discovered that this kitchen has been feeding Willow Creek in ways no appraisal could ever measure." He nodded toward Grace. "Before making any final decisions, I asked if the community would help me understand what happened inside these walls." One by one, people began sharing memories. Ruth Collins recalled the winter Evelyn quietly organized meals for 3 families after an ice storm cut power across the county. A retired firefighter remembered arriving home after exhausting overnight shifts to find warm bread on his porch with no note attached. The former pastor smiled as he unfolded an old church supper program listing anonymous donations for nearly 20 years. Although no names appeared beside the baked goods, Everyone in the room already knew whose hands had prepared them. Grace then opened one of the old cookbooks Martha had returned. More handwritten thank you notes rested between its pages. She read only a few aloud. A young mother thanking an unknown baker for preserving her dignity after her husband lost his job. An elderly widower writing that one unexpected casserole had reminded him he had not been forgotten after his wife's funeral. A teenager who had later become a nurse describing how Evelyn's quiet kindness inspired a lifetime of caring for strangers. None of the notes praised recipes. They praised the feeling of being seen without being embarrassed. Thomas stepped forward, carrying the oatmeal bread recipe with his own initials written in the margin. His voice trembled as he addressed the room. For weeks, I believed I was protecting my family by selling this house. I never realized this house had been protecting me since I was a little boy. He looked toward his mother. I thought those notes were about everyone else. I didn't know I was one of the people you quietly carried. Evelyn smiled through gentle tears. Parents hope their children remember feeling safe, she said softly. They don't expect them to remember how that safety was made. The room remained silent for a long moment. Then Daniel reached into his briefcase. Several people assumed he was removing the closing documents. Instead, he placed a single sheet of paper on the kitchen table. The sale will still go forward, he explained calmly. Thomas's shoulders fell for an instant. Daniel continued before anyone could speak. But after listening to this community, I no longer believe the best future for this property is the one I originally planned. He explained that he had already contacted his business partners. Rather than renovating the house into a private residence, he wanted to preserve the kitchen and partner with the Harper family and local organizations to create a community baking program. Evelyn would always have the right to remain in the home for the rest of her life, and the kitchen would continue serving the town exactly as it had for decades. Grace stared at him in astonishment. Thomas could barely find words. Why would you do that? Daniel smiled quietly. Because buildings earn value in different ways. This one has already been paying dividends for 40 years. I simply failed to recognize the right kind of investment. As afternoon sunlight poured across the old wooden table, the recipe cards, thank you notes, church memories, and voices of grateful neighbors finally formed one complete story. No hidden compartment had been discovered. No forgotten legal paper had changed everything. Ordinary recipe cards, quietly written margin notes, and the living memories of people whose lives had been nourished one meal at a time had revealed the true inheritance Evelyn Harper had spent a lifetime creating. Spring returned to Willow Creek with the familiar scent of fresh bread drifting through the open windows of the Harper kitchen. The legal closing had been completed exactly as promised, and every agreement had been properly recorded. Evelyn remained in the home under the lifetime arrangement Daniel Brooks had proposed, while the restored kitchen slowly became the heart of a new community baking program supported by the bakery, the church, and neighbors who wanted to continue the work she had quietly begun decades earlier. Every Saturday morning, children gathered around the old oak table wearing oversized aprons and flower-covered smiles. Evelyn no longer baked every loaf herself. Instead, she showed small hands how to knead dough patiently, how to crimp a pie crust without rushing, and how to leave room at the edge of every recipe card for one more handwritten note. Grace organized the classes, Daniel quietly covered maintenance costs, and Thomas volunteered every weekend, often arriving before sunrise to prepare ingredients. The burden he once believed he had to carry alone had become something the whole community willingly shared. One afternoon, as the first batch of cinnamon rolls cooled on the counter, Thomas opened the weathered recipe box and carefully added a new card behind the others. At the top, he wrote, "Community bread." The ingredients filled only half the page. Along the margin, he penciled a single note in the same careful style his mother had used for 40 years. Willow Creek, shared by many hands, no one leaves hungry. Evelyn noticed the card and smiled without saying a word. She simply reached over and placed her hand gently on her son's. She did not need an apology. His willingness to continue the story was all the forgiveness she had ever hoped for. Visitors still admired the old recipe box resting on its familiar kitchen shelf. Some expected to find a secret compartment or a hidden treasure inside. Instead, they discovered something far more lasting: ordinary recipes, tiny handwritten reminders, and a lifetime of quiet compassion carefully preserved between flour stains and fading pencil marks. The greatest secret the box had ever held was never hidden at all. It had simply waited for people to understand that every loaf of bread, every pie, and every casserole carried the same simple message: that kindness feeds a family long after the last slice has been shared. If this story reminded you of someone whose love was shown more through everyday acts than grand words, leave a small heart in the comments and subscribe for more stories about dignity, family, and second chances.